In Module 8, we'll be talking about socio-cultural resources management. The Philippine Constitution stipulates the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology, meaning the Philippine laws already recognize the importance of managing impacts of development on people, especially the vulnerable sectors such as communities and old cultural resources. It is a common notion that adding more people causes problems, but people are also a means to solve these problems. In the context of discussion on environmental management, the people can be considered as environmental stressors, impact receptors, or environmental managers. But for our discussion today, people are considered as impact receptors, meaning they receive the impacts of any development initiatives. Development initiatives basically aim at improving people's lives. However, development also poses adverse impacts on people. Development activities have both positive and negative impacts on the community. Negative impacts such as displacement, health impact, and resource use competition. Positive impacts such as revenue generation and job or livelihood creation. The Department of Social Welfare and Development is tasked to ensure community welfare, while the Department of Health is tasked to ensure that health impacts of development are properly managed. Let's now discuss the impacts on Indigenous people or Indigenous cultural communities. Throughout the 300 years of Spanish colonial rule, there were communities that were able to defend their territories and evade the colonizers, maintain their relative independence, while continuing to practice their own systems and ways of life. These communities comprise the indigenous peoples of the Philippines. There are no readily available, accurate, or official figures on the population of indigenous peoples in the Philippines due to the lack of any formal census. However, we have the following data. Indigenous peoples roughly constitute 10 to 15% of the total population of the country, and they are present in 65 out of 78 provinces. They are mainly concentrated in northern Luzon and in Mindanao. The indigenous groups in the Cordillera are collectively known as Igorot, while the groups on the southern islands of Mindanao are collectively known as Lumad. Indigenous people in the Philippines generally live in geographically isolated areas with a lack of access to basic social services and few opportunities for mainstream economic activities or political participation. They are the people with the least education and the least meaningful political representation. In contrast, in their ancestral domains, there are present commercially valuable natural resources such as minerals, timber, and water, making them continuously vulnerable to development aggression from both public and private extractive industries. Indigenous communities can be considered as a vulnerable component of the environment that should be given due consideration in environmental management. In response to this, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA, the RA 8371 was enacted to protect and promote the rights of indigenous cultural communities or ICCs and indigenous peoples or IPs. It also includes ancestral lands, domains in which the ICCs and IPs possess, occupy, and use, cover not only on the physical environment but the total environment, including the spiritual and cultural bonds to the area. These are the rights of the ICCs and IPs based on IPRA to determine priorities for development and to religious cultural sites and ceremonies, participate in the decision making, to recognition of ownership and control of indigenous knowledge systems and practices, and to develop own sciences and technologies, access to basic biological and genetic resources, to develop lands and natural resources, to stay in territories, to regulate entry of migrants, to safe and clean air and water, to claim parts of reservations. These are the responsibilities of ICCs and IPs to their ancestral domain. One, to maintain ecological balance, that is to preserve, restore, and maintain a balanced ecology in the ancestral domain by protecting the flora and fauna, watershed areas, and other reserves. Second, restore denuded areas, that is to actively initiate undertake and participate in the reforestation of denuded areas and other development programs and projects subject to just and reasonable remuneration. And lastly, observe laws. That is to observe and comply with the provisions of the Act and the rules and regulations for its effective implementation. The National Commission on Indigenous People is mandated under the law to carry out the policies set forth in the Act, manage the repository of relevant policies, data, and the implementing rules and regulations. Let's now discuss the management of impacts on cultural heritage. Cultural resources are collective evidence of the past activities and accomplishments of people. These include buildings, objects, features, locations, and structures with scientific, historic, and cultural value. Cultural resources are finite and non renewable resources that, once destroyed, cannot be returned to their original state. Cultural resources are an integral part of the people and can be considered as a natural resource that should likewise be considered in environmental management. Physical resources or properties are tangible representation of the Filipino culture. This includes old buildings, monuments, shrines, documents, and objects that may be classified as antiques, relics, or artifacts, landmarks, anthropological and historical sites, and specimens of natural history. Culture can give people a connection to certain social values, beliefs, religions, and customs. It allows them to identify with others of similar mindsets and backgrounds. Cultural heritage can provide a sense of unity and belonging within a group and allows for a better understanding of the previous generation and the history of where we came from. Realizing the importance of cultural heritage, the National Cultural Heritage Act, or RA 10066, was enacted. This act declares that the state shall foster the preservation, enrichment, and dynamic evolution of a Filipino culture based on the principle of unity in diversity. Cultural preservation was recognized in the act as a strategy for maintaining the Filipino identity as represented by both the tangible and intangible cultural resources. These are the key provisions of RA 10066: definition and categorization of cultural property and heritage, registration and conservation of cultural property zones, regulation of export, transit, import, and repatriation of cultural property, description of powers and role of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and other cultural agencies. These are the responsible entities for the implementation of the Act. One is the National Commission for the Culture and the Arts, or NCCA. This is the overall policy-making body, coordinating and grants-giving agency for the preservation, development, and promotion of Philippine arts and culture. Second, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. It maintains the Philippine Registry of Cultural Property classified as historical site, shrine, historical landmark, monument, or heritage house. Third is the National Museum that is mandated for research and management of our archaeological resources and sites. Other cultural agencies are National Library for Books, National Archives for Documents, Cultural Center of the Philippines for Culture and the Arts, and Commission sa Wikang Filipino for the language. Considering the socio-cultural resources management, there is a need to review how these various policies could be implemented smoothly, minimizing conflicts and redundancy, considering that there are many agencies involved. In principle, managing sociocultural resources is best undertaken by the LGUs, but adherence to relevant national policies and principles should be ensured. The current implementation of sociocultural resources management has to improve, especially in terms of isolating it from political motives. In this module, we have discussed the following. The Philippine Constitution recognized the importance of managing impacts of development on people. The DSWD is tasked to ensure community welfare, while DOH for managing health impacts of development. IPRA or RA 8371, protects and promotes the rights of the indigenous peoples. The National Cultural Heritage Act, or RA 10066, fostered the cultural preservation of the Filipino identity, in which responsible entities for cultural preservation are the following: NCCA, the NHCP, and the National Museum. Other cultural agencies are National Library, National Archives, CCP, and KWF. So that concludes our Module 8, Sociocultural Resources Management.